Well, good morning. Hey, it's sunny outside now. It wasn't sunny when I came. How many came when it was not sunny? Yeah, it's good to see the sun, isn't it? You know, you kind of start one of those days like just feeling kind of one of those days. And if you're here for the first time, welcome. We're glad you've joined us today. In fact, if you came today, when you hear the topic we're going to talk about today, you're probably going to think, really? I came today for the first time and this is what I hear? Because today we're going to talk about one of the three retro modern practices that Jesus talked about to his followers, which he said, hey, by the way, when you do these, this is not if, but when you do these things, this is how you ought to go about doing them. And today is very much like the topic of flossing. How many of you know that you are supposed to floss? How many of you every day, morning and night, floss? Well, we got to give them a hand for that, right? I mean, that's impressive. But I want you to notice how many of us raised our hand, all proud when we said, yes, I know that. But really? I mean, you got to get that little string, and you got to get up in there and work at it. You got to do all the teeth, and some of them are hard. And it's one of those things we know, but we don't really, let's be honest, the majority of us, we know it, but it doesn't do much for us. And today, and the third, as we conclude our series called Vintage, this retro modern practice of Jesus, we have looked at three things. The first week, and we'll see how well you remember now. The first week, we looked at the idea of giving. Thank you, that one person who had their answer right. Alms, yes. The idea of giving to the poor. And Jesus said, when you do that, there's a certain way you ought to do it, and a certain way you shouldn't do it. And then last week, we talked about the idea of, more people were here last week. Thank you. Prayer, right? But not just kind of normal prayer, not just sort of, hey, I pray when I eat, I pray before I go to bed, but kind of another step in prayer. And today, as Jesus kind of finishes this little section on his talk on that Sermon on the Mount, he's going to talk about this idea called fasting. To which all of us, when we hear that word fasting, go, oh no, right? Because it's a thing, right? It's kind of like flossing. We know about it, but the vast majority of us don't really do it, and it sounds like it's going to be kind of tough and hard and painful, and I kind of like eating, and I don't want to have to go without eating. We kind of get all that feeling. But let me just give us a summary for those of you that maybe don't have sort of religious background. By the way, if you're here and you're not really kind of a Christian, you're not a follower of Jesus, this doesn't apply to you, all right? That's just for those of us that are. But if you're here today and you're here because, somebody promised you lunch later, or, she's cute and that's why you're here, I want you to know that it doesn't apply to you, but you can look at the person who has brought you here today, who's a follower of Jesus, and watch them squirm a little bit today, okay? Because we're going to talk about this idea of fasting. Here's simply what fasting means. Fasting is a biblical concept where you deny yourself something in order to seek something deeper through self-control and self-denial. And here's the truth about fasting. Right? I'm not going to ask you how many have ever fasted because some of us would lie, and I don't want to have you lie today, all right? Because we think we fasted. We fasted because I had a blood test on Thursday, and I wasn't supposed to eat before I went to it. So I fasted from like 9 o'clock the night before, right? Or we get this fasting. Some of you have fasted your whole life from exercise. Right? And you would say, I've been fasting my whole life, Some of you have fasted your whole life from Brussels sprouts, which, by the way, I understand that completely, all right? But, fasting is not a diet plan, and fasting is not just kind of a temporary thing. Fasting is not sort of one of those, I was sick, and so, hey, I didn't eat for a couple of days, so, hey, I fasted. Hey, look at me. That's not the idea. Fasting is this idea that it requires something, this idea of self-denial, this idea of self-control. It just has a little bit of to it, right? And so we need to remember, fasting is no fun. And by the way, it isn't supposed to be, right? Because there's a purpose. As you look at in the Bible, as it tells these stories, that it encourages us to fast. And even when Jesus talks about it here, there's this idea that you fast for a specific purpose. In fact, one of the things that I just learned here recently was I always thought that fasting was sort of you went without anything for 24 hours. That was a true fast. But in biblical times, in fact, the people that Jesus talked to there, when he talks to them about fasting, it is much how we would understand it today, Muslims during Ramadan. This idea that you fast from the sun comes up and the sun goes down. that was a pretty much an accepted Middle East type fast. So this is not necessarily a 24-hour kind of fast, but in general, when a Jewish person said, hey, I fast at least once a week, that was sort of an expectation. Or if you're really serious, I fast twice a week. It was sort of this from, when the sun comes up to the sun goes down, I don't eat anything during that amount of time. And the Jews had this understanding, this belief that there was something instructive about fasting, that you would learn something about. You learn something about yourself, and it would also cause you to think about things in a little bit different way. And so that was really the purpose of fasting, to kind of get us to think about things in a different way, to begin to understand things in a different way. And here's the incredible thing, is the passage we're going to look at over Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18 today. Jesus is going to start off just like he has the last 2 weeks. And he will say, when you fast, and he's talking about you who consider yourself a follower of Jesus, when you fast and you're going, I don't fast, so he must not be talking to me, but he is, because Jesus expects that it will be a thing for us. And the question is, how do we make it a thing for us, and what's the purpose of that thing? And before we get to that today, I think we need to pray, because to be honest with you, full disclosure, I have fasted in my life, but I'm sure it was last century. So I'm with you in here with you on this, all right? But the thing we have to be careful of is not to believe that fasting is only for those that are really super serious. That Jesus thinks this ought to be something that we all do. And so we're going to talk about that. But before we do, let's stop and ask God to be with us again, all right? Lord, today I just ask that you be present with us in a different way. When we know you're here in this room, because you're always with us. You're always seeking us. You're always drawing close to us. But sometimes when we talk about these topics that seem so uncomfortable or so strange or so not so much a part of our life, makes us have questions. Makes us question if we're really as good with you as we think we are. But I know you're not about making us feel like we're bad. You're about giving us opportunities to take a different step. And so today we just ask you to fill this place with your presence, and that you speak to each of us individually, so that when we do fast, we will do it in step with you. And so be in this place now in your name. Amen. All right, Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 16. Jesus says, when you, there we go, play along with me this morning. When you fast, don't put on that is a gloomy, somber face like the hypocrites. Don't do it. I know you're fasting, but don't really look really bad like you're fasting. When you do it, don't be like that, because Jesus goes on and says, they make their faces look sad, that is disfigured, unattractive, to show people they're fasting, right? Here's this group of religious people. They want so much approval that they've turned these amazing spiritual practices into something else. They've turned them and used them for themselves so they get that approval. And for those of us in this room and those of us watching online that consider ourselves followers of Jesus, we have to recognize that we all have a deadly addiction for approval. And for all of us, there's always that temptation to do something spiritual because people know we're supposed to be spiritual. So we get a little feedback from them. An attaboy. A good job. Another gold star in our crown, And Jesus says, don't be like that. That when you fast, if you ever fast, don't have to put on this sad face. Don't kind of get caught up in all that kind of stuff, because he goes on. There's this irony of wanting to appear more spiritual than we really are. And we all face that irony. And how it's so counter. Jesus pointed out how counter it is to what people say they're trying to accomplish by doing that. And the reality is, the danger of hypocrisy is that it works. And it does. That's why we do it. You know? I mean, you pump up your resume a little bit because, hey, you know, it'll make you look better, you get the job. Who's any wiser, right? You know, you tell her you got a job and you haven't worked in 6 months, but I mean, you know, you had a job. That's kind of close enough, isn't it? And for these guys, they paint this great picture of how true this is, that the danger of hypocrisy is that it works, because Jesus says, when they do that, he says, I'll tell you the truth, those hypocrites, the ones that kind of look really gaunt and they're just dragging around because, oh, I haven't had anything to eat in so long, I feel bad. And everybody goes, oh, you are so spiritual. Jesus says, listen, those hypocrites, they already have their full reward. It's worked for them. And what they were after, they got from all this. But Jesus flips it around. It says, so when you fast, comb your hair, that is, put on oil on your head and wash your face, then people will not know that you are fasting. Now, I don't know if you've ever caught this when you've read this passage in the Bible. But isn't Jesus, what Jesus is asking us to do, isn't that about being a hypocrite? I mean, isn't that what Jesus is saying? Listen, when you're fasting, don't look like you're fasting. And a hypocrite is somebody who doesn't show, right? Kind of gives a different false front. What's going on here? I mean, because the first group, even though they're looking really bad, they're kind of going extreme, they are fasting. Which, by the way, if you've ever fasted, there are times when you just don't feel good. But their hypocrisy is they are hiding the true reason for their fasting. That it's all about them. And so when Jesus says, I'm asking you not to look as bad as you feel, he's not asking you to be false about this, because he's saying you got to figure out what you're doing this for. They're doing it so everybody goes, oh man, you're really serious. You fast twice a week? That's incredible. You know, and look how bad you look, you know, and the fact that you're up, out, moving around, as bad as you look. And Jesus says, listen, they got what they wanted, but if you're really in this for the real purpose for all this, then you need to look a little different way about this. And again, it's this idea of not sort of showing forth stuff. It's about doing stuff privately and secretly. And he goes on and says, listen, when people, you know, the people will not know that you're fasting, but your Father, whom you cannot see, by the way, will see you. And I talked about this last week, and I think it's such a great point for Jesus. Jesus recognizes that for us to understand God is hard because we can't see him. And I love the fact that Jesus sort of says, I understand that. I'm going to affirm that and say, listen, I understand you can't see Jesus. Or can't see God. He's unseen. But the cool thing about him being unseen is that he's everywhere. And so he's going to see you. He's going to see what's going on in your life. He's going to see what has driven you to this place of taking this step of fasting. See, we think that if no one knows, no one cares, right? And that's why you let it slip that, you know, this is going on in life or that's going on in life, because you want somebody to know, because then it seems like they care. And when they don't care, we feel all alone. But Jesus reminds us that your Father, that our Father, sees what is done in secret, that is in private, and he will reward you. And there's just been this pattern this whole time when Jesus talked about the idea of giving to the poor, helping somebody who's struggling out, and not letting anybody know about it. But God knows about it. When he talks about not praying on the street corners, not making a big deal out of your prayers, not, you know, clearing your throat at Denny's and making sure everybody everybody in the room, those bad people, you know. That neighbor with that dog that keeps coming down to your yard instead of their yard. You know, that coworker that's always yap. God lets the sun shine on them. God lets the rain come down on them, just like he does for you. And Jesus is trying to break a pattern that was for them and is that so tempting for us. And that is to see this as about a transactional thing. To see this about if I do the right things, I'm going to get the right stuff. It's sort of like I put the right amount of change in the machine and I hit the buttons and something comes out that I want. And Jesus say no. It's about something deeper. And here's what I want you to think about just for a moment this morning. Jesus makes this very clear. The Father who is unseen sees the unseen, right? The Father who's unseen, you can't see him. He sees all the unseen stuff going on, and that's a good thing according to Jesus. Because this is a who question, not a what question. See, the reward that Jesus is talking about, he never explains it. But what if? What if the reward that Jesus is talking about is the reward of God himself? The affirmation from a Father who's watching what's going on in your life. Of a Father who sees all that stuff. Who knows it's taking place. And maybe it's even brought a smile to his face today. Because this is not about a reward of stuff, this is about a reward of experience. Of what John Piper, a modern theologian and pastor, writes. As usual, Jesus is testing our hearts, not just regulating our behavior. And this whole idea of fasting, this whole idea of praying kind of in private, this whole idea of giving alms, giving to the poor, we can see all these things as sort of regulating our behavior, and that's not what Jesus is after. But he knows our behavior affects our hearts. And sometimes when we get the right behavior, it can get our heart, and sometimes when we do the right behavior, it can exclude our heart. And Jesus kind of warned us in these 3 steps to recognize the key difference. And the key difference is, why did I just do that? Why am I doing this? What am I hoping to get out of it? See, what if? What if all of these practices, that is the idea of giving alms, the idea of prayer, the idea of fasting, what if all of these practices are about interrupting our life? What if they're behaviors? What if they're practices that are intentionally to make us kind of stop and go, Because again, they're over and above. When he talks about giving, this is not giving to the church. It's not supporting the church wherever you're at. That's not the giving we talked about, right? This is giving to the people that are in poverty, the people that are out there, that need help. When he talks about prayer, this is not, again, sort of prayer, and it's not the prayers we do here at church. This is a personal thing where you take time to kind of step back away from everything. Find a place where you can just be alone between you and God, be safe because he already knows everything. So then it's just about the experience more than the words that are coming out. And what if there's on this whole fasting thing? It's about interrupting the normal pattern of my life because maybe, just maybe, the things in my life have distracted me. Maybe the things in my life have gotten a hold of me and I haven't recognized they have a hold of me because they're just part of life. And maybe breaking that pattern interrupts my life, which allows God to enter into my life in a different way. I think Paul understood this. Paul was kind of the person that's written the majority of what we call the New Testament part of our Bible. He's a guy who went this dramatic conversion experience. He was this devout Jewish person out to sort of stop the Christian church from starting and had this amazing conversion and becomes now one of the greatest proponents of it. And he had some great words over in a part of our Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And he makes this statement that I think is one of the most insightful, impactful, and powerful statements in the whole Bible if all of us would just simply say, what does this really mean for my life? Because I want you to hear what he says. He's quoting somebody, and nobody knows who he's quoting, whether it was a popular statement in that culture, whether it was something he had been quoted saying, because 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter that Paul writes the Corinthian church. We don't have the first one, so we didn't want to have a first one. You don't want to start something off with number 2. You got to start off with number 1, and so number 1 is actually number 2. I know it's kind of confusing, but he's responding to something. So people think this may have been something he wrote in the first letter. But whatever the case is, people knew this statement. The statement was simply this: I am allowed to do all things, that is, all things are permissible for me. Kind of what all of us do when we hit 18, right? I'm an adult now. I can do anything I want to do. To which you've been in that situation, your parents have said, fine. Remember, you got car insurance and rent and electricity and gas. Knock yourself out, right? But whether this was accepted or not, Paul doesn't disagree with this. He just says, listen, you're allowed to do all things. All things are permissible for you to either, you can do whatever you want, but then he makes this insightful statement. But not all things are good for me to do. That is, not all things are profitable, not all things are beneficial. And you've discovered that in your life, haven't you? You can't sit on your couch and watch ESPN all day long and eat pizza all day long and ice cream all night, every night. You can do that. But at some point it's going to dawn on you, that's probably not so beneficial to me, right? That is, if you can get off the couch. Maybe you just lay there and recognize that, right? But then he goes on. I am allowed to do all things. He quotes that statement again. But I will not let anything make me its slave. Isn't that great? I mean, in my mind, he captures the essence of what it means to be an adult. We can do whatever we want. But at some point, we recognize that everything's probably not so good for me. And some things have made me a slave. And in my mind, that's one of the benefits of making fasting a more regular part of our lives than flossing is for the majority of us. Because it helps us figure out if anything has made us a slave. So let's talk about fasting as we wind this down. I want you to finish this sentence just in your mind. Do not look at somebody and say, I know what yours is. Just look at your own. Think of your own for a second, all right? Finish this sentence. And I would suggest to you that if the answer is anything then God or Jesus, and I'll let you put your family in there, because if I say, no, I'm going to put your family lower than that, you're going to say, oh, okay, I'm going to fast. My kids, I can't live without my kids, but okay, I'm going to fast for them for a couple days. I'll take that pick. That's not what I'm talking about here, all right? But what is the thing that would just come immediately to your mind without any filter that you would say, I can't live without? And maybe it's that thing that you need to consider fasting from. And whether it's fasting one day a month, for a week a month, one day a week, from a sun up to sundown, or whatever the thing is, I just want to challenge you as we wrap this whole series up today. Do yourself a favor and find one of the things that falls in that category. Could be your phone. Could be whatever social media app you use. Could be television. Could be coffee. Now you went too far, Mike. The reality is, all of us have things that have the potential to enslave us. All of us have things that are parts of our life that aren't so beneficial, but because life has gone on and because this idea of fasting, much like this idea of prayer, specific prayer that Jesus talked about, much like this thing of giving alms, helping the poor, gets so separate from the normal flow of life that we have sort of forgotten it. And what if we just made the commitment for the next for the next 3.5 months, between now and the end of the year, what if you and I and all of us made just a commitment that we're going to try these 3 retro practices? We're going to try to give, to help the people, even those people that stand on that street corner every day with that sign. And you wonder about, am I really helping them? What if in this remaining time, and I know it's a busy time for us at church, we got tons of stuff going on between now and the end of the year. But what if we don't let the business push out the important and said, okay, I want to make sure that at least one day every week I'm going to try to just get a little bit of quiet time, just me and God, a way where I can just be myself with God, honest with God. What if I figure out that I'm going to fast? I'm going to shut off my phone on Friday night and leave it off till Saturday night. Or I'm going to cut back on this, not have it during, this 24-hour period, or maybe for this week, I'm going to step back away. What if you gave God some space to work? And what if that's what he's been waiting for this whole time? So that's my challenge to wrap up. Make that step for the next 3.5 months. I'm not asking you to fast every day. I'm not asking you to pray this way Jesus talks about every day. I'm not asking you to go that same corner every day and follow that. I'm just saying, make sure every week you're doing each of those things. Just give God some room. Because I'm convinced that when we give God space, He is more than happy to step into that space. And to do something that He could not do if we didn't allow Him that space. We talked about this last week. My challenge is for all of us to go beyond where we've been before.